Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. The mission of the museum is to teach the history of the Holocaust and advance human rights to combat prejudice, hatred, and indifference. While we are closed due to the pandemic, the main way we accomplish our mission is through our virtual programs. And tonight, I'm delighted to introduce a new program, Crucial Conversations. This first series looks at race and racism in our community. We hope to help give us all a context of historical and contemporary racism and learn some concrete tools to help disrupt racism. We will also, throughout this series, engage experts who will share their wisdom with us, share their ideas, their history, and their stories, and this will be an incredible learning opportunity for all of us. I'm delighted to announce tonight that the Crucial Conversations series is presented by Geraldine Acuna Sunshine and Gabe Sunshine, and the series sponsor is IMA Financial Group. Thank you so much for making this possible. I know if we were doing this in person, all of our audience would want to help express their appreciation, so imagine applause. Another way we fulfill our mission is through being a convener of leaders and organizations that are doing important work in our community. And I am proud tonight to recognize a host of wonderful community partners for this series. Circle 10 Council BSA, City Square, Dallas County Equal Justice Initiative Coalition, Denton Black Film Festival, Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square, Family Gateway, Human Rights Campaign DFW, Mosaic Family Services, REACH of Dallas, Refugee Services of Texas, Remembering Black Dallas, Resource Center, Temple Emmanuel, and Traffic 911. Such wonderful partners. Thank you all for being with us tonight and for sharing this with your members. Lastly, I would like to say a big thank you to our members who have been helping sustain the museum while we have been closed to the public. Your ongoing support during these very uncertain times makes such a huge difference. Thank you. So tonight's program will be a little bit different from some of our others. It may be a little longer. Don't despair. If you tire of the conversation, we will be recording this, and you can check it out on our YouTube channel, that's DHHRM, in the next week. I hope you'll stay with us, but I want you to feel like you can walk away and still be able to come back to the recording. We also will not be taking question and answers tonight. This is a conversation between Kamilah Collins and me, but we will have questions in the rest of the series. And so that leads me to introducing my partner in crime tonight, Ms. Kamilah Collins. Kamilah and I met at a Dallas Truth Racial Healing and Transformation retreat probably about 2 years ago. Time flies. And I was so impressed with Kamilah that when we were having difficulty in developing the content for our Beyond Tolerance theater that teaches about implicit and unconscious bias, I called Kamilah and asked for her help. I was worried that we might actually unintentionally be reinforcing stereotypes instead of helping people learn how to disrupt them. And she was so delightful and so skilled that we then engaged her to take our entire team staff through equity, diversity, and inclusion training last spring to prepare for opening this new museum. She also worked with our board at a retreat, and she worked with our education department to help us examine how we could offer educational programming to teachers, students, and adults related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in a way that was authentic to the museum. She is incredible, and I am so glad you're with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Mary Pat.
So this series. You may be wondering, why is the Holocaust Museum doing this? Remember, we are a Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I think all of us involved with the museum sat in horror and watched when George Floyd was murdered. And then as the days wore on, saw what looked like the emergence of a new movement that might bring about real change. And we wanted to be able in this virtual environment to be a part of this conversation. If you've been to our museum, you know that we end our Pivot to America experience, or that gallery, with the evolution of civil and human rights in the United States. It's very important content that is so relevant right now, but we're closed. So that led us to imagine this program, and we immediately called Kamilah and started brainstorming about it, right?
That's it. I think one of the first things that we talked about was, how do we do this in an authentic way? It was really important that we acknowledge this is not simply a moment that we're taking advantage of, and we didn't want some symbolic gesture or something that felt performative or disingenuous.
Absolutely.
We wanted to be thoughtful and intentional, and so we slowed down a bit. We wanted to consider what would feel right for us. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how this evolved.
Right. I think I asked you to help us develop a program we could air the next week, and you said,
Absolutely
probably not. And what emerged from that conversation is something that is very authentic to the museum. That's important to us. We study human rights through a historical lens. And so we wanted to have this series be rooted in history, but also to humanize that history by embracing testimony. If you can imagine, or if you can remember going through our permanent exhibition, we celebrate the testimony of our survivors throughout the Holocaust wing, and then in the Pivot to America wing of upstanders, particularly Texas upstanders. And, it's important, I think, to rescue the individual when you are talking about topics like this. So that was an important part of our plan. Then we wanted to have a call to action, just as we do in the end of our permanent exhibition, to get people engaged in doing this work. And lastly, to serve as a convener. There are so many amazing people working for racial equity in our community. We wanted to engage them and make sure that they were a part of this.
I think that's a big piece of it, is amplifying the voices that are doing this work. We have a diverse community, so why not? You are a convener. Give us the opportunity to include other voices in the conversation. So it's important to note that we're starting this conversation tonight, but as the series unfolds and the panelists are brought on, that is going to be a diverse representation. That's not just in our racial makeup, but in our industries that we represent, and as well as our personal experiences.
Well, and you might be wondering, during the pandemic and with the museum being closed, why we're sitting on the stage. And that's because, we wanted to have an authentic conversation. We wanted to show all of you that you can sit down with a trusted friend or colleague and have a difficult conversation. And we just felt like we couldn't do that on Zoom. So thank you for coming tonight.
I think it's also important to note that we are human beings. Therefore, part of what we are modeling tonight is intentionally taking risks, being vulnerable. This is a conversation between Mary Pat and I. She's going to have questions. I might have questions. And really, it's in an effort to share information with one another, to develop a deeper trust, and also perhaps to evolve our thinking. And the only way to do that is to engage in uncomfortable conversations. Now, sometimes this is more comfortable for some than others, right? But I also hold space even for not being the expert, but to continue to learn. So as you've now tuned in to join us in this conversation, please give us a little grace to know that we are being vulnerable, we are taking a risk, but it's really important to do it at this time and to show you that it is possible.
Right. You know, there are so much. I mean, I'm sure most of you joining tonight have been reading and watching videos and doing everything you can to get up to speed. And there's a lot of advice out there about things you should not say. And I found myself temporarily paralyzed by that and really afraid to have this conversation so publicly tonight in case I might say the wrong thing. But my history with Kamilah gave me the comfort and confidence to do that. You can see she's not judgmental, and she's going to give me the benefit of the doubt, and I appreciate that.
I think that's critical, right? At least in the work that I do, it is the commerce that I trade in is trust. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And part of that is because I believe in relationship and the power of collective action. And I acknowledge that we are all entering this work into different places, from different places, mm-hmm. and we need different things. And for some of us who have been doing this work for, this is generational work. So it did not begin with me and Mary Pat here, and it more than likely won't end with us. That's why it's important to invite you all into the conversation and encourage you to share what you learn and to offer your opinion, and to step into that space of vulnerability, because that's how we can build bridges, and it's also how we disrupt racism and we disrupt some of the thinking that is behind that. And so I think it's important for us to just delve into this conversation. Cool. And see where it takes us.
Oh my goodness, I think I'm ready. So again, before we get started, our intention tonight is to help model having this conversation, putting yourself out there and feeling maybe a little bit uncomfortable, but going ahead and asking the question, but also to ground us all in some basic terminology and definitions. So as you go on this journey with us and we move forward into the second session in the series, which is exploring the history of race and racism in Dallas, and the third session that looks at the present, and then ending in the future, you've got this grounding to bring you along on the journey with us.
Absolutely. I think we'll be exchanging information, creating an opportunity not only to affirm ourselves in what we believe, speaking truth to power, but also, again, just growing in our connection.
How would you say that this series is different from some of the other programs? There have been so many great resources and wonderful talks. I've been trying to soak it all up. How would you say this will be different?
I think part of it is that this is a partnership between us. Mm-hmm. So my approach to change and transformation is centered in the human experience, in people, right? And in our decision making, mm-hmm. and in our communication. So what is different is, first and foremost, it's you and I having a conversation. Right. Another thing to note that's different is that we are being intentional about the journey, right? So we're having a foundational conversation tonight, and then as we progress, we are bringing in people to talk about historical context. Right. Because again, we often assume when talking about race and racism that we have a shared meaning. And that's not always true.
Absolutely.
So it's important that we build throughout this series in what is our understanding, what are we saying when we say this, what do we mean, and then also what's that historical context. That's foundational, right? And part of that is even surfacing what's the uncommon narrative. What stories, testimonials are we not aware of that we're trying to bring to a collective consciousness?
Right, absolutely.
So there's that. And then I think us concluding with actionable ways to move forward. We're going to bring in people that are doing this work, continue to cultivate community, continue to disrupt racism. And by bringing them in, we're giving people an opportunity of how they can engage. And we also recognize that everyone's not necessarily ready to step into an activist role, an advocate role.
Right.
And perhaps that starting point is within yourself and having some self-examination. Or maybe it's some healing, some restorative practices might be what you need. And it's acknowledging that all of that work is necessary to move us forward, right? And that's where let's refrain from judging one another about where we're coming into this.
Great.
But at the same time, let's hold one another accountable that there is work to be done.
Exactly. Okay, well, let's get started.
All right.
So, let's start with just some basic terminology. And I'll start, with the foundation. Kamilah, how would you define race and racial identity?
So starting firstly with race. Race, a lot of people will say it's a classification, right? It's a box to check. It's kind of arbitrary. Well, race is a social construct. It was created with the intention to classify people, right? But the element that we don't often talk about is that there are real societal implications to race. Meaning, we know that race is actually not biological.
Right.
Biologically, we are all a part of the human race. We are all Homo sapiens. We are all more alike biologically than we are different. We know this. Science, we know that. Some people believe that in a spiritual sense, right? We're connected. There's oneness there. But what we can't do is dismiss that our country in particular was based on this notion of race within the construct of it being a hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Meaning there is value on human life based on your race. Right. So when I say race is not biological, but it has societal implications, we make associations based on how we perceive people. Mm-hmm. Meaning, I might think that race is physical appearance. It's your phenotype. It's your skin tone. Mm-hmm. But we also know that people that aren't technically of the same race might share the same skin tone. Yeah. So then race can't be your skin tone. Well, okay, Mel, maybe race is ethnicity, or maybe it's culture, or maybe it's country of origin. But if you look into each of those categories, you can be from the same place and not be classified the same race.
Right. Wow.
Dismiss that. You can also be of the same culture and not necessarily be of the same race. So a lot of times when we say race, we're using that based on our own understanding of what it is. But it's a construct. It's a fluidity. Mm-hmm. If I look at the history of what it means to be Black, African American, Afro-American, Negro, these are racial classifications that have been fluid over time. Conversely, whiteness has been fluid. What it means to be a white person in America has changed. It has granted people access to certain things. And so sometimes it's even instances where you could go just as quickly and change your birth certificate classification, and you could change your race. So it's not a real, it's invented, but it was invented with a purpose.
So I have been reading and trying to get up to speed, and what I've read is that it was invented really in the 16th century when Europeans started the slave trade.
Absolutely.
And it was a way to codify and justify that inhumane treatment of the African people.
Because you've got to think about this. If I see you as human,
right, then how
can I reconcile in my own consciousness treating you as property, as chattel, as inhumane as that is. Because what we know now is through cognitive dissonance, meaning there's a belief that I have, an attitude I hold, but my behaviors don't match that. And when that's brought to my attention, my brain tries to figure out and reconcile, and sometimes we rationalize, we minimize. We do all these things for it to make sense. And so in order to diminish the value of life, we said, okay, to be Black, to be an enslaved African, to be an enslaved Indigenous person, we take away your personhood. We dehumanize.
That's right.
And we know, even from the museum, dehumanization is a part of the stages of genocide.
That's right.
We can do horrific things by dehumanizing people. And so with that, I think we probably should move into the conversation of racism, right?
Absolutely.
Because a part of racism is a way to dehumanize and devalue human lives. Can you pull up the racism slide? Okay, so if we look at this, and you can keep that up, please, I'll let you know when to bring it down. With racism, it's important to note, specifically when I'm talking about racism, I'm not simply talking about racial discrimination or racial prejudice. With racism, I am talking about systemic power, meaning there are systems involved that support that power structure. So the equation you see at the top is racism equals systemic power plus prejudice. Then it's important to also note, systemic racism operates in multiple ways. Firstly, let's look at how that works for us internally, in our own minds. We process and perceive the racist structures that exist, and then we internalize that. We think certain ways, right? So in our pattern of thinking, racism can be internalized within an individual. It can also be interpersonal. That means the way I think about you, I am now taking action and interacting with you based on that. There's also racism that then is encountered institutionally. And a lot of times this is what we don't talk about. We are quick to see, oh, that's racist behavior, right? Because that's external, that's between people. There's impact there. But what we don't talk about is the internalized pieces of it and the institutional. So at the top of again, we're focusing on there's institutional, meaning there's systems and social procedures and practices and policies in our organizations, in our industries.
Wow.
That's another level. Then you take that and you accumulate it. You take, okay, if there's racism in healthcare, if there's racism in education, and you compound that, the effect of that is structural, right? So if you look at it in buckets, racism can manifest individually, that's internally and interpersonally, and then racism can also, you can encounter that at an institutional and structural level. And when we see legislative policy or when we see reform requests, that is at an institutional level. But all of those things is systemic racism.
And I think, we as individuals need to focus on our own hearts and minds, but to make meaningful change in our country, we need to focus on the institutional policies that have built this structure that makes it's so difficult for Black Americans to really have a level playing field.
Absolutely. And I want to take a minute to talk about when we consider racism and we consider that at a systemic level it's functioning in systems. And it's also focusing amongst us as individuals. It's important to note that power dynamic, right? So what I mean by that is systemic racism is a functioning under the ideology of white supremacy, of white superiority. So that means, as it's defined, to be white grants you additional access to that power.
Right.
It grants you access to being perceived as a human being. It provides you human rights, right? And so what that means is our proximity to whiteness versus our proximity to blackness, because it's now a hierarchy. The difference between it being a racial classification implies it's an even playing field. It's just categories. No, it's actually hierarchy.
So let's talk about that hierarchy and the complexity of language, through all of this. When you said white supremacy, I felt an internal jolt because I don't think anyone watching tonight wants to be a part of a white supremacy movement, but it's just the way our systems have been structured to give advantages to white people, and one terminology for that is white privilege. That's another term that I think makes some of us, white people, have this knee-jerk reaction that in saying that I'm privileged, you're somehow taking away my hard work, and all I have struggled and done to get to where I am, that it's negating that in some way. But I think if we're open and honest with ourselves and really reflect on that privilege, I think all of us can find examples where we have enjoyed that privilege. And I just wanted to share, I started on that journey in high school because I grew up in Austin in the 80s. Now you know how old I am. And during desegregation, and we had actually moved to a neighborhood that had a really great high school, Anderson High School, that was predominantly white. And we didn't move there because the school was predominantly white. We moved there because it was a really great high school. After 2 years, because of desegregation, I went through busing to the predominantly African American and Hispanic high school. And what I saw opened my eyes to white privilege. 2 high schools in the same city, progressive city of Austin. One hadn't changed since the 60s, and one was brand new and had every bell and whistle that you can imagine. And so that kind of started me on my journey and thinking about things that, I took for granted, that every student in Austin had that opportunity.
I think that's an important note, is that when we operate in our privilege, it's actually our blind spot.
Right.
It's an assumption that we make that everyone has access to this, or that this is normal. Right? Mm-hmm. And it's also important to note that with privilege, it's not something that you're opting into, because when we're talking about privilege, we're talking about institutional power. And by power, I mean that is social, economic power, specifically that when you look at, the stats will tell us, if you look across some of our social industries, our social sectors, meaning health and education, right, there's a common experience and access and understanding of folks that are marginalized. And if you are advantaged in society, then it is above and beyond what is common to Black, Indigenous, people of color.
Right.
Right? So making reference and noting a quick way to see social disparities and inequities is to examine closely all of our stats through a racial lens. Right. And I also want to note that there's a difference between how we identify, how we self-identify, versus how we are socially identified. And our advantages that we receive in society, whether that is economic and political power or social power, is not something that we opt into, because it's not something that we say, hey, so sign us up for this.
Right.
Right? It is something that is given to us because of institutional systems that are at play. So it's not that we are discrediting someone who has had struggles. It is to acknowledge that institutionally there have been barriers presented time and time again.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge, there's a continuum on that advantage, and within the white community there's a continuum, based on socioeconomic level, but that privilege still exists. There's a very, a different outcome of a white, 20-year-old person being pulled over by the police than a young person of color, and regardless of their socioeconomic status.
Regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their compliance. I think it's important for us to note, or at least pause for the recognition of how racism can be insidious and it's functioning even when we don't know it. Right. Because that was where that conversation of bias comes in.
So let's talk about implicit bias or unconscious bias.
With unconscious or implicit bias, it's our brain's way of creating shortcuts, right?
Right.
And our brain says, I see this, and this is what that means. And then this is how I need to respond.
And that is the way that we, if you think back to when people lived in the wilderness, you see a snake, you know how to react. It's a survival instinct.
It is. And what's important to note, specifically when you're developing your racial analysis, is that because of indicators in society, whether that's through media or that's through stereotypes that we have, there is a dehumanizing component that weaponizes blackness. And what I mean by that is that because I have black skin, I am perceived to be more of a threat. I am perceived to be something to be fearful of. There is a perception that there's also a word, it's called adultification. It's where black and brown children are perceived to be older, and they are perceived and expected to behave in more mature manner. And a lot of that stems back to these tropes and these characteristics that black slaves were labeled. Because remember, as a part of that system, you needed to dehumanize it. So meaning you needed to have a narrative that said, oh, the reason why we can do medical experimentation is because they're not human. Or the reason why we can work them day and night is because they're superhuman in strength. I believe there's linkages between that ideology, that public narrative, that if we are not actively aware of and bringing into our consciousness, because it's also another thing that's a bit dangerous with talking about implicit bias, because it allows us to opt out of being accountable for that. So once we're aware that we have a bias and we know that there are stereotypes out there, it's not that you can't do anything about it. It's what are you doing with that new awareness?
Exactly.
Because if anything, we need to be able to now self-regulate. And so some of the things that you and I are talking about right now, I'm even, kind of thinking about how, in my mind, how can one person, and also now, how can we all witness public deaths, public executions, public lynchings? I mean, this has been happening centuries. How can we now, we talk about videos going viral and we're witnessing it, but are we seeing the same thing? And I think that is, again, where we have this disconnect,
Right.
because you're seeing not just a human being. You may be interpreting, I'm seeing a black body, therefore I'm seeing a criminal. Mm-hmm. Therefore, they just need to follow the rules.
Right, right.
That's internalized racism, folks. If you can witness someone taking their last breath and not be disturbed by that, and you've got to think, we're seeing this often at this point, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's why this conversation is important to have, because this isn't just a social topic.
Right.
This is life and death for people. And that's not hyperbole, that's not exaggeration, that's the reality.
Absolutely.
And I make note of that because I think that we do all bring our own experiences and our own blind spots to this work.
Right.
So it's important for us to educate one another. It's important for us to consider a different perspective. So if you can, I'd like you to pull up that next slide. Let's see. I shared this a while back with Mary Pat, and she giggled.
Because I like numbers.
Right. And I share it because I think sometimes this is where our disconnect in communication happens.
Right.
I think sometimes we're focused on our perspective, and it's not to make light of the seriousness of this situation and the seriousness of race and racism, but it is to demonstrate that perhaps there's a possibility that what the other person is saying is valid and real. And they are sharing with you their experience, and it's different from yours. But we're both looking at the same thing. How can we come up with something different? Because perhaps we are both sharing our truths.
Yeah. And that unconscious bias that helps us make all of our decisions. For those of you who haven't been able to visit the museum, I sincerely hope we'll be able to open to the public soon. We're anxiously awaiting that day. But one of the last experiences you have is going through what we call the Beyond Tolerance Theater. And it's a 15-minute experience that introduces our visitors to the concept of unconscious bias. And presents 4 different types. There's so many. One is blind spot. I have a blind spot maybe because I feel like I've been discriminated against for a particular reason, so I don't think that I could possibly be discriminatory towards someone else. We just all have things that we are bringing to the table. And what we hope to encourage our visitors to do at the end of this experience is to first acknowledge, that we all make decisions that way. Really start to confront that in your decision-making process and start to disrupt it and change your behavior. Don't use it as a crutch, as you said. And we leave people, with some suggestions. Dig for facts, separate facts from feelings. Engage in self-reflection. Really try to be thoughtful about the decisions you make, and look for intent or underlying feelings that might be there that might be influencing your decision-making process. Search out and listen to a diverse range of opinions. That's one thing we're trying to do here tonight, but to be able to try to see something through someone else's eyes, I think is so important.
And I think even if you cannot understand it, I think sometimes we seek to fully understand it. A step in the right direction is to believe people.
Yeah.
I think sometimes we over-intellectualize it, and we want to debate the politics of it, or we want to dismiss what people are saying as because that couldn't possibly happen because it's not my experience.
Right.
And so part of having those diverse opinions, a diverse experience, is also to acknowledge that when we are in an oppressive system, and you may be a have, is that when someone that has been marginalized by that system tries to shine a light and bring into your visibility and your awareness something, believe that that is their truth, that that is their experience, because it's actually an opportunity for us to learn and to wait and say, hey, well, maybe that is their experience. Maybe that is something that we should all be looking out for.
Right.
Because as particularly as a museum that is honoring human rights, we are humans first.
Absolutely.
But we don't all have those rights. They are given discriminately.
You know, I'm so anxious for you all who haven't been to the museum to see the permanent exhibit. I want to take just a minute to talk about the gallery in which we teach our visitors about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It wasn't until 1948 when all of the UN member states came together to affirm that there were basic rights that all humans should enjoy. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was my grandmother's favorite person in the world, and hence my mother's, led the committee to establish those universal rights. And there were 29 fundamental rights, and the 30th one was that none of those rights should be interfered with. But what I've learned, through my work at the museum is even though all of the UN member countries signed on to those rights, it was just an aspirational document. No one did anything with it. The U.S. was not motivated to try to, move forward the discussion because we had legal segregation and discrimination at home. So it wasn't until after the civil rights movement and, well into the 70s that the new human rights movement started to emerge. And I just think that, it came out of the Holocaust, this paradigm of state-sponsored, unchecked hatred. And it was such a wonderful thing for the world, but we just weren't quite ready for it yet. And sometimes I wonder if we're still, if we're still ready for it. But it's something that we need to be working towards.
For me, that's the hope. If I didn't have that hope, that my human rights of my friends, of my families, that the value in our lives mattered. That's to me the driving force behind this work. That's why it's important. That's why this is critical to not just be a moment, because this is a moment of opportunity.
Absolutely.
And quite frankly, these moments come particularly at this level, where we are seeing such a dynamic environment, so many things. We're so polarized, right? There's such intensity behind the movement. We're seeing people in protest, in uprising around the globe. This is a moment it's scary, but it's also an opportunity.
It is.
It's an opportunity for us to make good on those human rights.
Absolutely.
Because it's the basic needs that we should have as humans, right?
It's wonderful to see, I can picture one of our docents in particular talking to the students when they come through and saying, which of these human rights do you think are important? Which one would you want to give up? And are there any that you think not everyone in our country enjoys? And it's an incredibly eye-opening experience. I want to be sensitive to our time. There are a couple more, sort of foundational definitions that I want to be sure and cover.
Well, there's a couple of things, if I may, and then I think I'll move us into another slide to really actually give people a better understanding, specifically on individual racism, because we tend to be comfortable in that, well, I don't do anything racist, but we just acknowledge in bias and blind spots, right? So there's one thing that comes up quite often when I'm doing trainings, and that's, well, microaggressions. And what is that? And what do you mean that, I've offended someone and I that was not my intention. Oftentimes, we really, in our interactions, focus on what I intended, rather than acknowledging the harm and impact that I cause. And the way that I describe microaggressions is really it's discriminating behavior where it's based on misinformation or a stereotype that I have, whether I'm conscious or not of that, and I act on that, or I say something, and often it's in how I communicate to someone who's marginalized. We see this in our sayings that are offensive, and someone will dismiss that and say, oh, that's just my sense of humor, I didn't mean anything by it. Or it shows up in social avoidance is how I encounter it. When been in spaces, it doesn't even have to necessarily be affluent. I can be walking on the street, or I could be on an elevator, and most Black folks will notice that, oh, they're uncomfortable, and it's not because there's a pandemic going on right now. It's not about social distancing. Social avoidance is when you perceive me as a possible threat. So if you're following me in the store because you think I'm going to steal something, or if you're clutching your purse because you think someone's going to take that, or it could also be that you're expressing some type of disgust. So we're in a conversation, and you're explaining your take on a situation, and there's almost this kind of sanctimonious attitude that comes off about a Black person, an Indigenous person, a person of color. Anyone who's marginalized really experiences microaggressions. And so I wanted to show the next slide, if you could, for people to understand overt versus covert racism.
So a microaggression would be covert.
Covert. You don't necessarily. The person who's doing it may not know.
Right.
But the opportunity in that is if you can see and it can be acknowledged and someone is actually verbalized to you, that was offensive.
That's right.
It's an opportunity for you to correct it. But oftentimes, we don't receive that correction. We immediately, that's not what I meant. We minimize it, right, or we deny and deflect and focus on how it made us feel, how it's making us feel for being accused.
Yes.
Instead of taking that as the feedback as a gift to you, that's learning.
Right.
They didn't have to say that. They could actually let you continue to go on about and offending multiple people.
And the offender, it focuses on the shame and blame, and can't see, because they're wallowing in that, they can't see what's
happened.
Done. Yeah.
And then the next level of that, I think it's good on the slide, but the next piece of that is a macroaggression, meaning it's the accumulation of these microaggressions.
Right.
So over time, it's like a drop of water that's slowly eroding away at my spirit, because I'm encountering this on a day-to-day basis. I'm also navigating through what a term that's called stereotype threat, meaning I'm taking my emotional labor to try to correct my behavior so that you're not afraid of me, so that I don't put time and energy in telling you that, oh, that was the racist thing you said, because it's going to be exhausting to hear you explain it away.
Right. It's the Harvard professor that puts on his bow tie and coat to go to the grocery store.
Yeah, there's an assumption that being professional and being it's part of it is it's a survival strategy, sure, right? To be sure, generationally, families of color have the talk, and they reinforce a strong work ethic where you need to work harder, twice as hard, 3 times as hard, so that way people don't assume you're lazy, so that people can see your value. It's if you dress this way, people won't perceive you. It's respectability, right? And all of these things are actually an emotional burden, an emotional tax that marginalized people, that Black folks, that Indigenous people, sure, that our Latinx folks that are carrying because they're trying to adjust. And all of that is taking up an emotional space.
I bet. It's
right?
exhausting. It's
and so I also, when I'm acknowledging the individual work that needs to be done, on one hand, if you've been called out or it's been named that what you're doing is not appropriate, take that as a gift, as challenging and difficult as it may be. It's also up to people of color and for Black people, brown people, all the BIPOC community, anyone that's marginalized really, affirm yourself. Right. Me showing up as I am, as the human being I am, is enough.
Right.
And although everyone else's racism has impact on me, my work might be me healing. It might be me taking a moment to stop educating everybody else and have my own restorative practice. Right. Because that is a toll. Not everyone signs up to educate well-meaning people about race and racism, right? This is my chosen profession because I am passionate and committed to seeing a change.
Right.
However, I encourage all my white friends and allies that want to show up. You have well-meaning intentions, but the impact you have on asking someone who's already oppressed to educate you, to take that on, is an additional burden. And some people do it willingly and graciously, and other people may do it in silence and say, no, I can't do that.
Well, and the good news is, I know these resources have been available. Mm-hmm. We weren't necessarily white, privileged white people weren't out there looking for these resources before George Floyd. So that's a very positive thing that's happened. But there are incredible books, there are videos. The museum has posted a Disrupting Racism Toolkit on our website. The Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., the incredible Smithsonian Museum, has
the Dallas Truth, Racial Healing Transformation. They have their website as well.
Absolutely. So there's so many resources that we can do our own learning and not put that burden on our friends.
But I think that is also the beauty in what we are offering through this series, right? It's an opportunity for us to have a conversation, to share that information, and also to share the expertise throughout with the panelists, right? The panelists are going to come with a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of experience. And for folks to continue on this journey with us of challenging racism, of talking about it, that's the great thing about, I think, what we're doing. And it's the unique spaces that we are creating points of entry for everyone. We're going down a highway, right, towards change. And one of the things to note is that you might go in your speed in your lane, and I'm going my speed in my lane. But it's important. Please don't be that stalled car, because that's impeding all of our progress.
That's right. That's right.
Just take some action, or take yourself off the highway and take care of yourself, right? And then come back on, because we want the flow of traffic. We want maximum capacity to do this work.
That's right.
Because it's not just us as individuals.
So would you, that makes me think of an example I've heard about how to be an anti-racist. Why don't you define anti-racist for us, and then I'll give my example, because it's very similar to that.
So again, having in mind that racism is systemic, meaning we're operating in systems, but it is also insidious and not necessarily in our consciousness. To be anti-racist, to me, is to make a conscious decision to challenge and disrupt racism. Right. See something, say it. Again, the work is at different levels.
John Lewis?
That's it. Yeah. The work is available to us all, but to be an anti-racist is to be active.
So again, I'm really trying to learn as much as possible. And I watched a webinar with Dr. Beverly Tatum, who is a clinical child psychologist and really an expert in racial equity. She gave an example that really resonated with me. Maybe it's simplistic, and that helped.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, it was a good thing. So to think about the conveyor belt that you see at the airport that moves people along, and when you're on that moving sidewalk, there are always the people that walk past you on the left. That's usually me, being impatient and hurrying along. You know, I would think of them as the active racists. They are moving towards their agenda. The people that are standing by and see them might think, well, that's not me, but they're still moving in that same direction. That's being a passive racist.
It's being complicit.
It is. And then, you know, and being a bystander. And then she gave an example. There might be people that, you know, think, well, I don't identify with that. I don't want to have anything to do with them, so they turn around. But they still are moving in the same direction. Turning around didn't stop what was happening. So to be the anti-racist, you have to actively walk in the other direction, you know, faster than you're being pulled towards, you know, what is human nature for us and what's just baked into our society. So I loved that because it sort of clicked for me.
I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think it is important for us also to take a moment to acknowledge equity, the role of equity. There's a term that's used often now.
So how is that different from equality?
So we can move to that next slide. We can show folks here. It's a little bit of a visual. So equality is sameness, meaning we're all have equal access, equal rights, and if I give you the same thing I gave someone else, that means I'm giving you the same opportunity. When in actuality, we have different needs. There is diversity of need because there is systemic racism that exists, right? And so along that line, there's inequities, right? So if you look at the picture, the image, when you look and consider equity, it's considering that we have those different needs and different challenges along our path to opportunity. So we can all be moving towards something, and we have different barriers to attaining that. And so with equity, we're meeting those unique needs.
It's not one size
It's
fits all.
not one size fits all.
Let's talk about a few more terms that I wanted to, you know, sort of unpack while we're together. One would be, you know, saying I'm colorblind. You know, I think for a while that white people said that and really felt like that was a good thing. You know, I don't see color. Everyone's the same to me.
And I think, let's be honest, when we're talking about terms and language, as we as a society evolve and learn, we are able to then evolve our thinking. And we're able to understand that colorblind, to say that I'm colorblind is to say I don't see you. So it's another manifestation, or at least a function of racism. The term is called erasure.
Okay.
And what that means is, if you tell me that you're colorblind, that tells me you don't see me. And another way to look at that is that you don't see my humanity. You don't see my experience. You don't see that our struggles are not the same.
Right, right.
And so it's a way of invalidating. And that's what we don't want to do.
Exactly. You know, we, you know, at the museum speak often about the fact that children are not born with hatred in their hearts. But children do see color. And I think studies have shown that children notice that one child looks like them and one doesn't, and will just naturally navigate towards the child that looks more like them. It's a comfort level.
And I think studies have also shown that children see and have connotations of race.
Yeah.
Right? If you look at the doll
I hate that.
experiment, right?
Explain that in case people
And
haven't.
so for
It's
folks
awful.
that you can look it up, I won't spend too much time, I won't belabor it, but essentially it is where you have children of color, black children, white children, and they're selecting dolls. And they can choose which one doll they like. And the bias is that regardless of the race, the racial identity of the child, they all had, more of them had positive associations with the white doll. And they would ask the child, well, why did you choose her? And they would choose, well, she's prettier, she's smarter. And what this is that even as children, we internalize racism.
Right.
And so part of that is why we find it's incredibly important to have diverse representations, to have diverse stories and narratives so that people can see themselves in a positive light.
I think we're finally starting to make progress with children's toys and with animated films, with Barbie. Barbie now is coming out with women that are scientists and.
But I think
mean,
again, those
diversity.
to understand that these are the biases and these are the stereotypes
That's right.
that exist, even in children. Mm-hmm. It says that we do have a lot of work to do and to unlearn.
Well, they see everything.
They see it.
They do. Tell, we probably need to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter.
Okay.
As we start this conversation, I just wanted to be open and say that as a Holocaust museum, it would be hard for me to support the Black Lives Matter movement because they have taken a stance against Israel in their political platform that feels anti-Semitic. But I think we can all agree on the foundational, message of the importance, that Black Lives Matter. And it's sad, when things become politicized or, a meaning becomes a movement, sometimes it changes. But I would love for you to explain sort of how that movement evolved and what it means to you.
So I'll start by saying that the evolution in my exposure to Black Lives Matter began 2013, 2014 as a hashtag. So it was not just a trend, but it was something that was in response to the killing of Trayvon Martin, the 17-year-old black boy who was killed, gunned down by George Zimmerman. And there was...
Just for walking through his neighborhood.
For walking through his neighborhood, right? Again, why was he perceived as a threat? Again, so we talk about weaponizing black skin. We talk, we talk about adultification.
Right.
And we saw that loss of life as an injustice, right? And for me, that loss of life was seeing someone that looked like me and the people I loved. Mm-hmm. And the signal that I got with the acquittal of him was that our lives didn't matter. And so I offer that as context because when the hashtag was initially trending, it could be taken a couple of ways. One, it is a declaration that Black lives matter, that we are human beings, that we are of value, that we are living and breathing beings that are being killed, and that phrase was a way to elevate, specifically to elevate anti-Black racism. And then it became reoccurring with Philando Castile. You saw all these different people, Black people, that were dying, being killed, and we weren't questioning it. So then it became, to me personally, it was a question: Do Black lives matter? do you not see this as a historical pattern now?
Right.
It's violence against us. It's questionable circumstances, right?
Isn't there evidence to the contrary?
Right.
Yeah.
But again, think back to the picture. We're not seeing the same thing. Clearly, we're not seeing the same thing. So I say that because it's a phrase that has resonated around the world.
Right.
And that's demonstrated during a pandemic. People are risking their lives to take to the street to make this declaration. Right. See my blackness, see my humanity, acknowledge that we exist and that we deserve to be treated as humans, that we have these basic rights. Because what was happening was we were witnessing public executions with a lot of the camps. That's what it was feeling like, right? So for me, yes, Black Lives Matter is an organization with chapters, international chapters, right? And they have a political agenda that is for legislative reform. It is also a crying out from a community for recognition of discriminate behavior, of injustice, and of blatant loss of life, right? And so for me, I have to humanize that, right? For me, it isn't exclusively something that's political. Sure. For me, it's personal. And I want to also, since we're talking about Black Lives Matter and kind of where that the beginning of that and what it meant, let's also talk about all lives matter.
Right.
And that notion, right? We've given you some framework today to understand that racism is systemic, right? It's intentionally dehumanizing, and it's to also uphold economic and political power in the hands of those who are socially defined as white. And when we say, or someone says, all lives matter, it's important to note that that was in direct response to the visibility of Black Lives Matter. It wasn't something that was just out there that was trending and people were saying.
That's right.
And so when we look at it through that context, it's erasure. Because what are you removing from the lives that matter? You are removing the black.
The black.
Erasure. And then you add to that a history of misappropriation, meaning you're taking away from Black culture, Black intellectual capital, and you're taking it and you're turning it into something else. Right? And so part of that in the systemic racism that I have seen is that there's this that perpetuates the cycle. One is that in America, there is an appreciation, to a certain extent, of Black culture as popular culture. There is a valuing in Black economic value, meaning there's the Black buying power, right? You see marketing campaigns, and there's that, right? But there, at the same hand, we are also devalued in our human rights, and in our expression of those rights and our declaration of those rights. And that's what I see when I see someone respond and post all lives matter. All lives matter. I see it as anti-Black.
So I want to share with you a quote, because when I was thinking about this tonight and thinking about, I've heard people say all lives matter. Why do we just have to say Black lives? This is a quote from Elie Wiesel about neutrality. So he says, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. The center of our universe right now needs to be Black Lives Matter.
I can't say it any better.
Elie Wiesel was an incredible human being. And he lived through, just unimaginable horrors, and has taught us all so much. So, I think, Kamilah, we've talked about equity, we've talked about anti-racism. Is there anything that we've sort of missed before we wrap this up?
I think that we've covered quite a bit, and then there's so much left to the surface, right?
There is.
One of the things I want to note is that we do need everyone to play their part, right? Mm-hmm. Can all lives matter until those that are furthest on our margins are brought into their full humanity? I say that with a heavy heart because it is a privilege for me to be able to be here in good health and to have shelter that I can go to, right? To be an entrepreneur, to have partners like you, right? And I say that because I would be remiss in not acknowledging that my own privilege, right? Sure. I identify as a Black woman in America, proudly. But I'm a cisgendered Black woman. And what that means is the gender that I was assigned at birth matches my gender identity. And in the scope of people who are being oppressed, people who are losing, there's loss of life, there is trans Black women that are also dying. And so I say that to illuminate the fact that even as a person of an oppressed group, I'm still privileged. And I think if we could all take that spirit to acknowledge that there are areas in which I'm socioeconomically privileged. I'm privileged in education, right? It's tough work to do, but we all have some thinking to do and to unlearn, but there's also things that we need to activate within ourselves and in our awareness. So I want to share this next slide specifically, if that's okay,
sure.
With ways to disrupt or challenge racism.
Absolutely.
And part of that, again, is reflecting on how is racism present in your life. We had the slide about covert and overt. We talked about individual levels of racism versus institutional and structural. So take time to really digest that. And that's not a one-time thing. That's continuous. Create space to be courageous. That's what we had. I mean, this conversation had tension, it had discomfort, but ultimately, because we have that shared trust between us, we did have to step into our own vulnerability. Sure. We did have to step outside of what our own self-interests were. And create a space for that. So that doesn't just come through osmosis. We need to be intentional.
No, I was nervous
right?
about having this conversation.
You, so was I. You're the only one.
In front of hundreds of my closest friends.
Just the closest. And then also naming racism.
Right.
Right? Calling a thing, saying this is what it is. And then asking questions, taking accountability for yourself to research and then to share what you learn.
Right.
Whether that's a misstep and a oopsie, or it's something that's really valuable and resonated with you. Carry that forward. Then when you're confronted with correction, take that as the spirit of the thing. So when I say, Mary Pat, I don't know if that's not what, I don't think that's what you meant, but take the correction, right? And it's not always, I think sometimes we're focused in the delivery. You're not always going to have the person that says, oh, you shouldn't say that. Sometimes you're going to have the person that you made angry.
Yeah.
And so it's just taking that in stride and understand that's actually a part of the work.
Right.
Right? So what I look forward to is also how we continue and further that learning in the panels, right? And so that other piece with diversifying your information.
Right.
A great way to do that is through books, as you have provided some examples. That's through TED Talks and podcasts. That's really another great way. But also expanding the people that you follow. If you are on social media or you have your favorite news channel, sometimes that's expanding and seeing what other people are saying.
Sure.
So diversifying is a great way for us to open up those blind spots. And then lastly, it's be active, not just an ally, be an accomplice in disrupting this, right? Yeah. Be an advocate, take action. And in whatever one of those ways that really resonates, that's what you should do.
Terrific. Well, we, I think have just barely scratched the surface tonight. We could go on, and you can tell I could talk to Kamilah all night long because she's wonderful.
Thank you.
I realized in horror that I don't think I read your bio, and I am so sorry. Kamilah is a very accomplished professional who has experience, in helping organizations, large and small, all over the country. She's the president of Collins Collaborations and has 20 years of experience in this field. And one of the things I loved about her when I met her is the value of working with partners. And she's got some organizations that she's worked with for many, many years. And we'll put her bio up on our website somewhere. So I apologize for that. Shame on me.
No worries.
But I'm going to try to be better about the shame thing.
It'll be okay.
Yeah. So, what's next for us? I mean, we've started the process with this conversation, and hopefully you'll be reading, you'll be moving along this journey with us, and then on August, I'm going to put on my glasses here. In the pandemic, I've started wearing glasses to read. So on Thursday, August 20th, the next session will be the past. And we'll be exploring, the history of race and racism in our community. And we wanted to be sure that was from a diverse group of people of color and not just the Black experience. And so we have 3 panelists. We'll have much more information about them on our website and then the night of the session, but I just wanted to share it will be Dr. George Keaton, who's the CEO of Remembering Black Dallas, a retired teacher and guidance counselor from DISD. We'll have Sol Villasanya, attorney, adjunct professor of law at UNT Dallas College of Law, and author of Dallas's Little Mexico, where he grew up. And then Jody Voice Yellowfish. Jody's an ambassador for American Indian Heritage Day in Texas, Indian Citizens Against Racial Exploitation, and chair of MMIW Texas. That stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. So we are so grateful that they have all agreed to share the history of their communities with us in Dallas so we can root our understanding in this history before we move forward to look at the present. That session will be September 10th. There is a lot to be positive about. In our community, Dallas has a Black mayor, a Black chief of police, a Black city manager, a Black person who's the chair of the Dallas Regional Chamber of Commerce and of the Citizens Council. But there is still so much work to do. There is so much inequity left. And so we want to really explore that, again, through the lens of testimony and really understand how racism has impacted our panel. And then lastly, on October 5th, we'll look at the future. Great organizations like Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, City of Dallas, that are working hard to make a difference and hopefully be able to give you all some organizations that you can get engaged with to be a part of the solution. That's our call to action. So I want to thank you for going on this journey with us. As Kamilah said, with the car analogy, some of us are gonna go at different paces. Some of us are gonna be more comfortable and less comfortable about this. But I think if we all take this journey together, we have a chance to create real and meaningful change. And I'd like to close by reading one more Elie Wiesel quote. He said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." And ladies and gentlemen, we may feel powerless, but we know from studying history and from studying incredible upstanders who have made a difference in the lives of those around them that we really are not powerless to prevent injustice. We have the power to be upstanders. We have the power to stand up for others and their rights, to combat injustice, inequality, and unfairness. And when we see something wrong, to say something and to work to make it right. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks for being on this journey. I encourage you to go to our website and look at our Disrupting Racism Toolkit and to really work on educating yourself between now and the next time we come together in August. Thanks so much for being with us. Good night.